Hey there, everybody. This is Kenny. Welcome back to another edition of the Leading from the Middle podcast. This is the podcast for middle managers who want to develop themselves, develop their teams, and improve their results. I had an awesome guest join me today. The CEO of Bunny Studios, Santiago Jaramillo, joined me, and he was able to really share some of his best practices, talked a little bit about what Bunny Studio does, but really talking about how leaders should be embracing AI. How do you build great teams, not just in person, but remotely as well? And what's that balance like from worrying about the human side of all of the folks that we support, but also getting great results while ensuring a quality of life? He talked about so much more. You don't want to miss his advice. Let's get at it. Hey there, everybody. This is Kenny. Welcome back to another edition of the Leading from the Middle podcast. I have got a terrific guest here today that has done it time and again. And we're going to get some leadership advice from him today. We're going to hear about how you can build great remote teams, so much more, and especially going to be inspired by his backstory. So I want to introduce the CEO of Bunny Studio. That is Santiago Jaramillo in the building today. Santiago, how you doing there, sir?
I'm doing very good. Thank you, Kenny. Thank you for the kind introduction.
Yes, no, thank you so much for being on. And I want to really start with getting your backstory because I think it's amazing. I think the audience will feel it's amazing too. So give us your backstory and how you've landed now at the CEO of Bunny Studio, and what does Bunny Studio actually do?
Definitely. So what we do at Bunny Studio is that we connect creators around the world with brands. Think about voice actors, designers, videographers, and then we just add a technology layer that allows certain processes to scale. We help a lot of audio advertising networks to build the networks. We help companies to actually dub content. We help companies or marketing teams to scale design content. And we do a couple of things here and there in that regard. And I've been leading a company for the last 3 years, but I've been part of the company for the last 12 years since
Wow.
its inception. Uh,
Wow.
and then Bunny is quite a unique company in the sense that we are about 75 remote people working from different locations in the world. We are based in Singapore, Spain, Brazil,
Wow.
Colombia, the US. So
Wow.
we are around the different places. There's about 10,000 creators that build the platform. So these are 10,000 people that are also remote, different locations. And then the big part of our business is in the US, but interestingly, management and a lot of the team that are building the company are not in the US. So this is kind of so quote unquote, the American dream of building an organization in the remote world, where you build all the setup behind the scenes for it to happen, but you're really building it from different places, wherever you may be.
Wow. Wow. So what led you to do this? What was the inspiration for you? What's some of your background on maybe some of your early jobs that got you to do this?
So I've actually always been a builder in that regard, a problem solver. And when I was at college, my first job was actually like many of other college students. I did tutoring, and I studied in Colombia. I'm Colombian, by the way, and I studied in Bogota when I was at college. And I was just giving math classes or English classes like many other people. But I was very lucky to actually be referred to a lot of other parents. I was probably 19, 20, and I got a lot of parents referring my services. And then without realizing it, I ended up not only taking those classes, but referring many of my friends to that.
Wow.
And within the first year, I ended up referring potentially 5 or 7 people. And then I had my best friend with whom we ended up saying, hey, what if we make this a business when we potentially just refer more people? And like, again, I was 20. I little did I know about business. What if we just take a cut and then we become millionaires, right? Like I was 20, I was going to become millionaire giving classes.
Right.
Um, but then we ended up, without realizing it, within a couple of years, being able to connect somewhere around 75 college students with 300 kids. Uh, and that happened while we were at college. So my first job was actually my
Wow.
first company, uh, going from giving my own classes to a couple of students to scaling it on a very modest way to somewhere around 75 tutor, 300 kids. But interestingly, what we ended up doing, which connects the dots to potentially where I'm at today, is that in that first job, we talked about technology.
Hmm.
And this is, let me go back. This was 2007, 2008. And when we talk about technology, it was a matter of using how do I coordinate a lot of parents and a lot of college students to actually be at the place where they have to be, organize the subjects that they were good at. And again, very early on, I got my best friend who was a developer to actually just build the first platform that would connect the dots.
Hmm.
From that job, I ended up going to a second company that I also built, which is taking the learnings from the tutoring space. What if we could build a marketplace for learning? And back in the day, we focused in South America. It was Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. And it was a different experience where we were able to fundraise, scale it faster. But I don't know if you recall, but 10 years ago, everything about technology was don't worry about the business model, worry about the users. And then once you have the users, you will figure out the business model. So my
Yes.
first company was a profitable company. My second company was like, I don't need to make money. I just need to get users. I got a lot of users. I never figured out the business model. So eventually it crashed.
Oh,
And when that happened, I ended up connecting with my partner at Bonnie Studio today, um, who is Alex Torrenegra. And then with Alex, we were talking about his experience on the voiceover industry. He had come from building a previous successful company called Voice 123, which is another large marketplace in
yes.
the voiceover industry.
Yes.
And then we had a couple of conversations on how we could make the voiceover industry different, what was happening in the voiceover industry, and how we could actually automate and make some fulfillment processes faster so that people could connect with creators at a different pace, at a different speed. That said, that's been 12 years since we actually started Pony Studio.
Wow. Wow. And I'm so glad you talked about already a couple of lessons along the way. I was going to ask you that. That's an incredible, incredible story. And it just seems like you're a couple of steps ahead of the game all those years ago, talking about some things that we probably weren't even thinking about, back then. And I remember Voice 123 when I was doing some voiceover work. I remember they
Very
helped
good.
me out a bit. I, I want to go back to um, the remote worker part because from what I can see, you're doing that at such a high level where a lot of folks struggle with having that many remote workers. So, what are some really important do's and don'ts when it comes to leading a remote workforce?
I think it all starts on how you think about your organization, and it comes with a statement. And the quick statement is you have to define if you're in-person company, a hybrid organization, or in this case, a remote first company.
Mhm.
When we built Bunny Studio many years ago, we became remote because we were a lot of immigrants in the US. And we had connections with our backgrounds of our countries in South America or other places. And that connections allowed us to build bridges. And when we were building those bridges, then remote became an obvious thing to solve. But
Mhm.
then in the process that we ended up understanding is you have to define yourself as a remote first organization because when you bring down your systems and your processes below, then you're thinking on a remote equation. If
Mhm.
you're thinking of a hybrid organization, then you're thinking, I have 2 or 3 hubs around the world or multiple hubs around the world. And you're flexible with people in different locations. When you build your objective setup framework, it's different if you're thinking from it as a remote organization and how everyone is involved in that uh, objective setting as a remote organization versus there might be 2 hubs that define objectives and then the rest of the people adapt to those objectives. Or if
Mhm.
you're an in-person organization where most likely you have a week, you have a room, you have a week where you set objectives, you have a room where you go, and if you're not in the room, then you're going to be missing out around objective setting. You have to think about, am I remote first? And if I am, all of the systems, regardless of what they are, they start to adapt to that remoteness component.
Mm. That makes so much sense. And I think a lot of companies have had to change that on the fly after COVID. Um, so so defining as a remote organization vital. Now what are some things you connect with your leaders in order for them to connect with their teams what are some best practices there that you always tell them that they can get the most out of their remote workers?
I think that I always go back to one concept that I once read, and it was very uh, funny, anecdotal, and it clicked a lot, which is the kitchen concept. And then when you think about in-person offices, and when you think about when you're going to an office space, there's a lot of investment on designing a proper kitchen. And you think about and you read about, oh, Google is investing this amount of money in the kitchen. Why is that? And that doesn't make sense. When you think about it from a management point of view, when you're doing your work in whatever computer desk you're doing it and you get blocked, your initial reaction in an in-person office is you stand up, you go to the coffee place, you go to a kitchen and you grab a coffee.
Mhm.
And then what actually happened is serendipity. There's a lot of work that happens around serendipity that we don't think about it really, which is, well, this is John, and John is having his coffee, and then I don't know, Jane arrives and he's, hey, what's happening, John? And he's like, hey, I'm having this problem, and then Jane said, oh, well, I'm actually connecting. Let me connect you with this person who might actually be able to help you, and then a lot of the work and a lot of problem solving happens in the kitchen,
Yes.
and that happens in an in-person space, and that's very interesting because when you think of a remote organization, well, you don't have the kitchen. If you're
Right.
blocked, you just go to your kitchen and there's no colleague that's going to arrive to your kitchen. So
Right.
what you want to be mindful about is what's the serendipity that happens in an in-person organization, and how can you be more mindful and intentional on building those spaces by design. And a couple of things that we do, there might be one that is genuinely like. It always goes back to feedback, right? Like building something, receiving feedback, putting back again and receiving feedback. There's a couple of frameworks, but there's one that I really like that actually comes from Pixar, which is called a brain trust.
Mhm.
Brain trusts are really good spaces where everyone at Pixar, and then you replicate it in your company every single week. When we get to see that beautiful movie every summer about whatever Pixar is doing, has gone through a back and forth of intentional feedback on 1 hour space where someone that is building one part of the movie actually has to share what they're doing with their peers and from different perspective receive feedback. And
Mm.
then every single week, every 8 days, the movie gets constant and constant feedback that
Mhm.
eventually ends up in a beautiful movie where everyone has had an input. If you think about a company and you don't have the kitchen that we were talking about, where there's a lot of feedback happening, well, we introduce something like brain trust and we put them for our product teams, from our marketing team, for our sales teams, where every individual from one of those functional areas bring one part of the project that they're working on, and then different peers from different areas share their feedback on the project that they're working on. And then they just keep a healthy pace and a healthy open space where people can exchange ideas. You're being mindful of putting that in space.
Mm.
That's one of them.
Mm.
And then you think about many other things. Even when we were during the COVID days, uh, the fact that you're a remote company doesn't mean that COVID was easy. Because one
Mm.
thing is being remote, the other is you didn't get out of your house. Those are two different things.
Right.
So we put a lot of games and we put a lot of open spaces that were flexible. Some of those spaces actually remain today. Like yes, Wednesdays, depending on the times when morning or afternoon, there's a little bit of a half an hour game that people can opt in or opt out.
Mhm.
And then if you think about it in that games, you have labs, you share some anecdotes, you make it more personal than work related. You're bringing those capsules from an in-person space to a remote scene more intentional. I think that's where it goes.
Wow. You said so much there that is just so dead on because it took me back, Santiago, to going to an office every day. And you're right, not just ideas, but relationships that build just grabbing that cup of coffee or even running into somebody down at the Starbucks,
Yep.
and but being able to now duplicate and recreate that remotely, that is just so dead on and it keeps people engaged, keeps them involved. Man, that is just awesome. And so now let me ask this. How do because I know for you it seemed to be not even a concern, but somewhat of how you solve this of making sure that you have that balance because sometimes when you're working, I know when I worked remote out of my house, I sometimes didn't know when to turn the computer off and and just take that downtime. Whereas that, you're in an office, okay, I know I need to go home now. How do you balance that against, still getting productivity, still hitting deadlines, but having that work-life balance?
It actually blends a lot in terms like there's this concept about work-life balance. There's a second concept that I think appeared on the literature a couple of years ago about work-life integration, where you
Mm,
have more
mhm,
flexibility on your day as an individual and your day as a professional.
mhm,
And then we are very flexible on how people organize their schedule. Of course, there's a couple of areas that have schedules, like people that are doing customer facing roles, they do have a schedule. But even then, we aim to be flexible on how you approach time. And if you have a medical appointment in the morning, well, just share a message with your team saying, hey, I'm going to have a medical appointment in the morning. I'll see you in the afternoon, and then project go around. But
mhm,
to your question on how to integrate it, it's very challenging. Um, from what I see from the team, and including myself, you don't get 100% of the team, not even 80% of the team, to act on the same way. You're
mhm,
going to have people that are very crazy replying at midnight here and there. And then you're going to have people that are very organized in that, you know what, I'm going to be very productive. I'm going to start at 9, very productive for 4 hours. I'm going to take my lunch and very productive until 5, and do not call me after 5.
mhm,
And I think you live with both efforts. What you want to be intentional and be mindful is about making sure that people are not burning out
mhm,
rather than making everyone fit under one system. A couple of
mhm,
years ago, we tried, and there's a new version of it, a 4-day work week.
mhm,
And it was super interesting. It came out as during the days of COVID again. Uh, we all lived COVID in a different way, and it was very intense for our brains in different perspectives. Um, Burnout was a very common topic, specifically for parents. And then we said, hey guys, let's put a 4-way working experiment. And what we ended up learning is that the work that people were doing in 5 days, they were able to actually accommodate it in 4 days.
mm,
One of the things that happens in not only in remote organizations, but in office organizations is that you go to your computer, you reply a couple of emails, and there's a lot of procrastination that happens in between the next email that you have to send,
right,
or in the next line of code that you have to do.
yeah,
When you give the intention and you build frameworks that people can have autonomy over, hey, Friday is a no-show office day, even if it's remote, like a no-show Zoom, potentially no-show Slack day, people would organize their days on a very personal matter to make sure that Monday, Thursday, they would actually deliver the same that they were delivering in 5 days. And that
wow,
was super interesting.
yeah,
Um, it actually ended up connecting to something that we call today push, play, learn, where Friday is a free day, learning day, or actually you push a little bit more. But there's a lot of self-organization that happens around putting the frameworks, focusing that people are not burned, and actually making sure that you give people the right time off to enter.
mhm.
I don't know if I answered the question the way
You
that
did.
you potentially were looking for, but those were the things that came to my mind.
You did, and I love that you are really emphasizing that your leaders have that flexibility to realize that we all work a little bit differently. I did some things online last night around 10 o'clock, and I realized that that's never been my time. My eyes were burning. I had a tough time concentrating. Whereas at 9, 10 in the morning, I'm on, and it's great that you're having your leaders realize that, and then giving everybody the flexibility to do that. And the 4-day work week, that's really, and you're not just throwing away that fifth day. I love that you're putting out, hey, we could, use this day for more learning and things like that. I want to ask you this, and then I want to ask you about AI. One more question on remote and
Mhm.
leadership. Um, what are some of the first steps that you recommend to your leaders to build that just great, unbelievable remote team? How do we go about hiring? What are a couple of hints and tips that you give your leaders today?
Today, like I go back to many years ago where we were experimenting with a hybrid version. It's about 5 years ago, and it was very interesting to get the people that were at an in-office space in that hybrid version. They thought that remote wouldn't necessarily work if we went fully remote. And I remember the first Monday that we gave on management was like, hey, I understand if you're doubtful about remote working, but before you can actually say that remote is not going to work, you have to spend 90 days without going to your hub. This was a hybrid version of the company. And
Mhm,
it's like, if you're going to tell me that remote doesn't work, go and live it yourself and see how it goes. And it was very interesting because it could be very confronting in the first couple of months even the first quarter, to actually be in a remote setup when you're doing in-person or hybrid, because you're adapting. It's deconstructing how you've done work for many years. Uh, but that forcing yourself to be in a remote setup gives you the perspective of how it is to be a remote team member. Because if you're in a hybrid version, in an in-person version, and you have someone remote here and there, it's like, oh no, we're communicating perfectly. And then you realize that you're communicating on a Fridays 2 p.m. in the office. And then the person that is at the other end is actually not listening to the information that you were sharing. So when
Right.
you force yourself as a leader that is transitioning from a hybrid in-person to a remote setup, put yourself and force yourself to leave it as how would someone would actually leave it. That's one of the things. And that goes into management in our team who has not gone through remote. It's like you're going to be living and it's going to be interesting to go through the remote experience. That's number one. When you think about hiring, we've been very lucky of being always a global company and understanding how to somehow read between skill sets and strengths
Mm.
and cultural differences. I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you I've had interviews that last half an hour or 40 minutes with an individual, and there's always one person that I recall that I jumped on the interview and it was 3 minutes and the interview was over.
Wow.
And I went back to the manager of to the person who was doing the recruitment. Like, he asked me, what do you think about the person? I'm like, literally, the interview lasted 3 minutes. I have no input to give you. Like, you tell me if this is the right person or not. And then there was some cultural difference, and there were some around the functional area that the person belonged. There was some difference on the expectation of communications. But as a matter of fact, the guy was great on the skill set package. And
Mm-hmm.
then you get to understand there are different nuances on how work happens and people connect. And then when you actually put a really good framework to reviewing a skill set and to reviewing a strength, you can apply that anywhere in the world. The
Anywhere.
same interview that you're doing in New York, in Los Angeles, you can put it in Nigeria. You can put the framework in Brazil. You can put the framework in Singapore. And they're going to go through the filter and you're going to have conversations. And the recruitment is less complex than what would that one actually would think it might be. And then you find great talent anywhere in the world.
Wow. That's just great advice, and I love how you said there's just some things that are universal, man. That you can New York, LA doesn't matter. That is awesome. Those are a couple of really great tips for leaders today, and so now I'm the picture's really coming why you've built such a successful brand for yourself there and this company for so many people. I want to ask you about AI, Santiago, and I'm not as familiar with AI as some folks are. Could you just give a brief overview? But I think the real question I want to ask is, should leaders be afraid of AI?
I think they should embrace it.
Ah, okay.
I, I think it goes with all of that. By the way, I'm sure there are a lot of more experts in the market talking about AI right now, and they're going to give you a full in-depth review of what's potentially going to happen. I can tell you right now, I have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm more curious and intrigued about seeing how the world will look about the next 15 years than being assertive of this is how the world will look in 15 years. Um, I'm going with the right in that regard. But then I think everyone should embrace it. And I'll give you a couple of examples internally as management. Um, I was talking to the person who leads people ops at the company the other day, actually yesterday, and I was asking her, "How's the week going?" And she told me it's been the most productive week in a while. And I asked her, like, what is making it productive? And she told me, I've been asking every question that I have about the role to ChatGPT 4, and it's giving me so good ideas on so good places to actually discover that is making it extremely productive. And that was super interesting. This is
Wow.
people ops, which is
Yeah.
not necessarily quote unquote the place that people are thinking about where the technology should be used. And people ops actually being very productive. If you think about engineering, I'll give you a couple of examples and I get into another element in a second. But when we talk about engineering, there's something in engineering that are called unit testing. And it's something that a lot of engineers don't want to get into. Every management in engineering is gonna tell you you have to do unit testing, which is making sure there's code that reviews the code and actually finds issues within the code. But that makes development slower, just more assertive, but it's slower. So there's
Mhm.
always a friction about building it. For unit testing, you can actually use these tools to actually build faster code that is going to review your code. And then you focus on developing what you're putting together. But then the unit testing part, you can delegate part of that work to actually make it faster with these assistants, as one would call them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there was another one. One person that is leading outbound in the company was integrating one of these tools to actually build mirror list about our customers. So we send them the list of the customers that we have, and we said, "This is my database of customers. Can you find me 2,000 companies that mirror these companies?"
Mm.
And we got 2,000 lists in about 2 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
And it
Wow.
was enabling the sales team taking the database. So instead of having to figure out which company they have to do, there are many ways in which companies build this. By the way, this is just a very quick hack on how to actually build a list.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mandate that I would get in terms of management is the this is an actual objective for Q2 is every team in the company, every individual in our company has to start integrating any of these tools and build a post-mortem 90 days later about how they use it. Was it worth it? Did the result work? Did the result didn't work? And I think that's the way to explore it.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
is true that a lot of jobs will be replaced. I think that's something that one cannot cover the rise to.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
the question that we don't know is the speed, the magnitude, and then what are the other jobs that are going to be created.
Mm-hmm.
But there are jobs in the market that will be replaced in this high speed generation that we're living on.
Yeah.
It's a matter of like, it's another variable to keep into consideration of how you upskill your proficiency and upskill your skill sets.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. You broke it down great, by the way. And that's so interesting. And I love that what you said at the beginning, we've got to embrace, especially leaders, right? Have to embrace it. Be interesting to see how that all shakes out. Santiago, this has been amazing. You have just in a less than a half hour given such great hints and tips for leaders out there and really painted a great picture, especially in the remote workspace. But your advice wasn't just for remote workspace. I think it was for everybody. My last question, and I'll make sure I post it. How can people contact you and use your company?
Oh, thank you. So you can go to actually bonniestudio.com. That's where people actually can find out what we're building and some of the solutions around creative work. You're actually going to find a couple of AI tools that we're putting together in the scene as well. And then how can people connect me? My handler is at about Santiago on Twitter. And I can actually be reach out through that.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, pretty easy. Okay,
Yeah,
fantastic.
straightforward.
Oh man. Well, listen, I can't thank you enough for your time. This was amazing. You're doing amazing work. I love your energy and your enthusiasm, and you just have a nose for leadership. And I love that. And thank you so much for so openly sharing that with the audience. This was just a phenomenal 30 minutes to spend with you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kenny. You're very kind with your words, and hopefully this resonates to someone that is listening in your audience.
Thank you. It definitely will, folks. So this has been the Leading from the Middle podcast with Kenny and Santiago. Talk to you real soon.
Bye.